On March 9, 1974, a Japanese soldier emerged from the Philippine jungle after 29 years of combat, still carrying hundreds of rounds of ammunition, a working rifle, and hand grenades. His name was Hiroo Onoda, and he had been fighting World War II for 3 decades after it ended. When asked why he never surrendered, his answer revealed something profound about the society that shaped him. I sincerely believed that Japan would not surrender so long as anyone Japanese remained alive. This isn't just the story of one extraordinary holdout. It's the story of how an entire nation transformed itself from a medieval society into a modern superpower in less than a lifetime, and how that transformation created a culture so intense, so devoted to duty and sacrifice, that it would ultimately lead to catastrophe. Let me take you back to the 1850s, when Commodore Matthew Perry's American fleet arrived in Japan and found what appeared to be a completely medieval society, soldiers with swords and spears greeting steam-powered warships. Yet within 40 years, this same nation would defeat a major European power in war. Within 70 years, they would control an empire spanning the Pacific. How did this happen? And more importantly, why did it go so terribly wrong? The answer lies in understanding what one historian called Japan's most distinctive characteristic. They were like everyone else, only more so. Whatever qualities other societies possessed, patriotism, duty, sacrifice, discipline, the Japanese seemed to have them turned up to 11. This intensity would be their greatest strength and their fatal flaw. What happened next was extraordinary. A group of reform-minded leaders overthrew the old military government and launched what's called the Meiji Restoration, returning the emperor to symbolic power while they modernized Japan at breakneck speed. They sent observers around the world to study what made other nations successful, then copied the best practices, British naval traditions, German military organization, Western industrial techniques. Within one generation, they transformed Japan from a feudal society into a modern industrial state. But here's where it gets complicated. They didn't just adopt Western technology, they deliberately grafted it onto traditional Japanese values, creating something unprecedented. They took the old samurai warrior ethic, a code called Bushido, that emphasized loyalty, honor, and willingness to die, and injected it into their modern military and even their school system. The government essentially said, "We need to be as strong as the Western powers to avoid being colonized like so many other Asian nations. To do that, every citizen must be willing to sacrifice everything for the emperor and the nation." They turned the emperor into a living god, placed him at the center of all authority, and created a system where questioning government policy became almost tantamount to blasphemy. Here's where the intensity factor becomes crucial. Most modern nations wanted patriotic citizens and disciplined soldiers. Japan wanted something more extreme. They wanted every man, woman, and child to be willing to die on command with the same devotion that an elite special forces unit might show. Consider this. In traditional societies, military leaders might award medals for actions above and beyond the call of duty, recognizing that there are limits to what can be asked of ordinary people. But in the Japan being created during the Meiji period, there was almost nothing considered above and beyond duty. The cultural expectation was that extraordinary sacrifice was simply ordinary duty. This manifested in shocking ways. Soldiers were told that being captured was worse than death, that they should kill themselves rather than surrender. Mothers sent sons to war with daggers, instructing them to commit suicide rather than face capture. This wasn't rhetoric. This became reality. No organized Japanese military unit would surrender during World War II until ordered to by the emperor himself after Japan's formal capitulation. Japan's modernization succeeded brilliantly, almost too well. In 1895, they shocked the world by defeating China in war while losing fewer than 1,500 soldiers in combat. It seemed almost cost-free. Then in 1905, they defeated Russia, a major European power, in a war that stunned global observers. For the first time in centuries, a non-Western nation had defeated a Western power in modern warfare. But here's where the analogy I want to use becomes relevant. Empire building is like a drug addiction. The initial hits seem wonderful. Raw materials, prestige, strategic territory, and the costs appear manageable, but then you're hooked. You've made investments, lost soldiers, conquering territory, and now you can't give it up without looking weak. Worse, each conquest creates new vulnerabilities that seem to require more conquest to protect. Japan took Korea, then Taiwan, then gained concessions in Manchuria, a region in northern China roughly the size of Texas, Louisiana, and Alabama combined. Each acquisition seemed logical, even necessary. Korea was called a dagger pointed at Japan's heart. Manchuria had coal, iron, and wheat, resources Japan desperately needed. But controlling Manchuria meant having a massive border with the Soviet Union and dealing with Chinese resistance. Each solution created new problems requiring new solutions. Here's where the governmental system created a catastrophic problem. In the Meiji Constitution, the military answered only to the emperor, not to civilian politicians. This seemed fine when the emperor actively directed policy, but what happens when the emperor chooses not to intervene? In the 1920s and 1930s, you had a bizarre situation. The civilian government couldn't control the military, and the military itself was faction-ridden and divided. Junior officers influenced by ultra-nationalist groups with names like the Black Dragon Society and the Cherry Blossom Society began taking matters into their own hands. They would assassinate politicians, stage coups, and even start wars, claiming they were acting in the emperor's true interests. There was a concept in Japanese culture called gekkokujo, roughly translated as justified insubordination. The idea was that lower-ranking people could, in certain circumstances with pure hearts and patriotic motives, disobey their superiors. This might work in a stable society with clear boundaries, but in the fevered nationalism of 1930s Japan, it became a recipe for disaster. On September 18, 1931, junior officers in the Japanese army stationed in Manchuria blew up a section of railway track, a Japanese-owned railway, and blamed it on Chinese forces. This fabricated incident was used as justification to conquer all of Manchuria. The Japanese government in Tokyo was caught completely off guard. They hadn't authorized this. They tried to restrain the army, but the army just kept advancing, achieving victory after victory. Here's the perverse dynamic. Each time the army disobeyed orders and conquered more territory, the Japanese public, fed a steady diet of propaganda about Japan's lifeline in Manchuria and the need to stand up to Western powers, cheered wildly. Politicians who wanted to restrain the military risked assassination by ultra-nationalists who would wrap themselves in patriotic rhetoric. Meanwhile, Japan's international reputation collapsed. They walked out of the League of Nations when condemned for aggression. They were increasingly seen as a rogue state grouped with fascist Italy and Nazi Germany, with whom they eventually signed the Anti-Comintern Pact in 1936. The real disaster began in 1937. After years of piecemeal aggression, incidents, and provocations, China's leader Chiang Kai-shek decided his country couldn't keep backing down. In a dramatic public statement, he essentially declared that China would fight. No more retreating, no more concessions. What followed was a conflict of staggering brutality and scale. The Battle of Shanghai alone lasted 3 months and cost approximately 300,000 casualties, more than America lost in all of World War I. The Japanese army, despite its skill and modern equipment, found itself in a war it couldn't win. China was simply too vast, too populous. For every city Japan captured, there was more territory beyond. For every Chinese army destroyed, another formed. The Japanese found themselves in that terrible situation I described earlier, like being caught in ocean breakers, forced to dive under each wave by swimming out deeper, getting further from shore, knowing you'll eventually drown, but having no other choice in the moment. When Japanese forces captured the Chinese capital of Nanking in December 1937, something horrific occurred. For weeks, Japanese soldiers engaged in systematic murder, rape, and destruction. Estimates of civilians killed range from tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands. The exact numbers remain disputed, but the reality of massive atrocities is well documented by Western observers present in the city. Why did this happen? There's no single answer, but several factors converge. Soldiers brutalized by intense combat, officers who had lost control or didn't care to maintain it, a military culture that viewed Chinese as racially inferior, and that same intensity we've discussed throughout this story, but now twisted into something dark. Remember, this was a military that trained soldiers by having them bayonet live prisoners. A military culture where wanting to be photographed while beheading a captive didn't seem unusual to some participants. The cultural values that created soldiers willing to die without hesitation could also create soldiers capable of extreme cruelty, especially toward an enemy they'd been taught to view as subhuman. By the late 1930s, Japan was trapped. They couldn't withdraw from China without losing face and dishonoring the sacrifice of hundreds of thousands of dead soldiers. But they couldn't win in China either. The war was draining their economy and resources. The United States and other Western powers, horrified by reports of atrocities and concerned about their own interests in Asia, began imposing economic sanctions. Japan needed oil, steel, and other resources to sustain its war machine. Most of these came from the United States and European colonies in Southeast Asia. As sanctions tightened, Japanese leaders faced a terrible choice: back down and lose everything they'd fought for, or expand the war to seize the resources they needed, which would mean war with America and Britain. The military culture that had been created over 70 years, the governmental system that gave the military unchecked power, the ultra-nationalist ideology that made compromise seem like betrayal, the emperor worship that prevented rational policy debates. All of these elements combined to make war seem like the only honorable option. When Hiroo Onoda finally emerged from that Philippine jungle in 1974, he was disappointed by what he found. Japan had changed. The fanatical devotion to the emperor, the willingness to sacrifice everything, the intensity that had defined his world, it was gone, replaced by something more relaxed, more materialistic, more Western. But was this really a loss? That intensity, that devotion, that willingness to die, these things had allowed Japan to resist colonization when almost every other Asian nation fell. They'd enabled an extraordinary modernization. They'd created an empire spanning the Pacific, but they had also led to catastrophic war, millions of deaths, atomic bombings, and utter defeat. Onoda and the other holdouts represent the end point of a journey that began in the 1850s. They were the purest expression of everything the Meiji reformers had tried to create. Soldiers who would never surrender, who would fight for decades if necessary, who valued duty above life itself. They got exactly what they wished for, and it nearly destroyed them. This story matters because it shows how quickly a society can transform and how dangerous it is when cultural values are deliberately manipulated and intensified for state purposes. The Japanese people weren't inherently more violent or fanatical than anyone else. But when their government spent 70 years systematically cultivating extreme nationalism, emperor worship, military values, and a willingness to die, when they created a system where the military couldn't be controlled and where dissent was crushed, when they combined modern technology with medieval devotion, they created something unprecedented and ultimately catastrophic. The Japanese civilians who died in American firebombing raids, who suffered through atomic attacks, who lost sons and fathers in pointless battles, were they responsible? They'd been shaped by a system they didn't create, conditioned by propaganda they couldn't escape, threatened with violence if they dissented. Yet their support made the whole catastrophe possible. Perhaps the real lesson is about the danger of intensity itself. Patriotism becomes dangerous when it cannot tolerate criticism. Duty becomes tyranny when it allows no limits. Sacrifice becomes meaningless when it's compulsory. Honor becomes a prison when it prevents reasonable compromise. When Hiroo Onoda stood at attention in that Philippine clearing in 1974 and finally laid down his weapons, he was surrendering more than just his rifle. He was surrendering to the reality that the world he'd fought for, that intense, devoted, fanatically loyal Japan, had to die so that a better, freer, more humane Japan could live. It took 30 years in the jungle for Onoda to learn that lesson. It took Japan's entire civilization, being brought to the brink of extinction, to learn it. Let's hope the rest of us can learn it without paying such a terrible price.